Hi everyone, welcome to our talk. My name's Sarah Motto. I'm one of the OTs working at Beyond Autism, and this is Jess, and she's also an OT working at Beyond Autism as well. Yeah, if you'd like to put any questions in the chat at any time, please do, and then we'll get to the questions at the end. And just a reminder that the recording has started and it will also be available after. So I'll start to introduce myself. So I'm Sarah Motto, and I've worked as an OT across different schools, charity settings, and also overseas. And I mainly specialise in working with paediatrics, specifically students with autism.
Hello, my name is Jessica Hargreaves, as Sarah said at the start. I've predominantly worked in schools, community settings and home settings, but for most part schools, and always with paediatrics since being qualified. So that's an area I've obviously specialised in, now particularly autism and sensory processing. So our objectives that we're going to go through today and hopefully answer for everyone here will be that we will go through the different senses and have a look at them. Facts about sensory processing, challenges that we may see with sensory processing. Then we're going to go through some real life examples to look at how this might impact real people with autism. And then some strategies that we can implement at home, autistic people could implement at school or work or in their community. And then we're going to have a look at the links to our strategic objectives just at the end of this PowerPoint. Okay, so first up, we are going through the sensory systems, as I've just mentioned. So the 8 systems that we'll be focusing on today are the tactile sense, so this is touch, and this helps us function in everyday tasks, and this also helps us to discriminate between objects. So for example, if you put your hand in your pocket and you might be looking for your keys, your tactile system will help you to differentiate between your keys and say a packet of chewing gum, so that you don't need to use that visual system. The tactile will help us with that. We then have our sight, so our visual system, and that helps with our ability to see. Again, we will discriminate our environment, so being able to look at a piece of paper and we will ignore the borders around the edge and we will read the sentences that we want to read. That's us discriminating our visual environment. Then we have our auditory system, so that's our ability to hear and process sounds. So yes, all of those noises in the environment, again, discriminating out those ones that we don't want to be hearing. Say I was having a conversation with Sarah in the office and another person was having a conversation, I would focus on Sarah and I would discriminate those two, that I didn't want to be listening to the other person's conversation, I want to listen to Sarah. Then we have our olfactory system, which is our ability to smell. This sense is very closely linked to memories as well, and that's why smell can often be quite emotive, and because it's linking quite closely to those memories. So say the smell of wood might really remind us of going to a particular place. Say if you have to go to Centre Parks every year, with that smell of wood, you might just take you back there. We then have the gustatory sense, which is our ability to taste. Then the next 3 are ones that aren't so well known. So to kick us off, we've got our proprioception, and this is where our body is in space. This is located in our joints and our muscles, and it helps us to know where we are without using that visual sense. So an example of this is being able to tie an apron. At your back, you can feel the threads and you can feel the movements that your hands are doing without being able to visually see it. So it takes some practice, and we need to have good body awareness to be able to make sure this sense helps us a lot. But that's our proprioceptive sense. Then we have our vestibular sense, and that is where our head is in space, and that's linking to balance as well. So that's located in our ear, has a lot to do with that equilibrium, and obviously works with gravity in knowing what way is up, so that, yeah, we know if we're hanging upside down, we can relocate ourselves back upwards, but also if we're falling over, then we can put our foot out to stop us falling. So that's our vestibular sense. And then finally, we have interoception. And this one is, I'd say, newish to be talking about, but obviously we've always had it. That's our internal feelings. So feelings of hunger, our feelings of being in pain or sick, of needing to go to the toilet. So that's the eighth sense that we will be looking at today. And this one is a tricky one because we obviously can't do that for someone. We can't replace that sense, because only we know what we're feeling inside. So yeah, they're the 8 different senses that we will be talking about today. Okay, so what is sensory processing? So our sensory processing is our ability to take in a stimuli, make sense of it in our brain, and produce an appropriate reaction. So, for example, here, if you hear the fire alarm, your brain will know, okay, that's the fire alarm. I need to get up and appropriately walk out the building and go to the nearest fire exit and the fire meet point. So it's our brain, when it is unable to process the stimuli in our environment, we experience dysregulation, and that then often results in an inappropriate behaviour. So you can imagine that if we have difficulty processing auditory input, if we hear a fire alarm and our brain isn't able to process that auditory input, we then won't produce that appropriate reaction of getting up and calmly walking out of the building. And we will go into a little bit more detail further down in this PowerPoint into what we might see and why that might be when we're not processing those stimuli appropriately in our environment. Okay, so a little bit about challenges with sensory processing. So when does it become a need? We all have sensory processing and we all use it all day, every day. So as I was going through those senses before, then we can all think of examples when we feel for things in our pocket, as I say, when we use our proprioceptive sense to be able to do activities and get around our day-to-day. Also, we use our senses to keep ourselves safe. So we use our visual sense and our auditory sense to make judgments as we're moving around our environment. We can see that there's a piece of uneven pavement. We're not going to step on that because that might cause us to trip. I mean, sometimes obviously we don't always take in this environment appropriately, but most of the time we're able to utilize our senses to keep us safe. And there'll be times when our senses are heightened and times when our senses aren't so heightened and we are feeling more sort of lethargic. So we all have differences in our sensory processing, and we all have sensory preferences that we will seek out throughout the day and sensory avoidances that we will try to avoid throughout the day and we will be more adverse to. So when we then are talking about sensory processing challenges, we are looking at when it is impacting upon function through our day-to-day lives, when it's causing potentially self-injurious behaviours through that seeking of input. Say, for example, if we had an autistic person who was biting themselves to get that proprioceptive input, then obviously that's a sensory processing need because that's causing harm to themselves. And also those that might result in behaviours that challenge. So that might be harming other people or the environment around us, any sort of behaviours that challenge that impact our autistic children or young people from being able to appropriately get on with their day. So yes, we wouldn't stop sensory seeking and self-stimulatory behaviour if it's not causing any of these things. We would always give our autistic young people, any autistic person, the chance to have that sensory processing. So for example, like in our day-to-days, we would have movement breaks. We might go out for a walk at lunch. That fresh air might really help us. So we're feeling that tactile sense of like the fresh air and the wind on our skin, or maybe the sunshine. And that's helping us process throughout the day. And so we need to give our pupils and the general autistic population the chance to have those different sensory needs met throughout their day as well. We also, is really important to bear in mind that we can control, as adults, we can control our environment more so than potentially what children and young people might have to do. So, for example, they have to come to school. If you needed to go to the supermarket, they would have to come with you because they can't stay at home by themselves. As whereas if we had an aversion to, say, loud noises or busy environments, then we might order online. But because our children and young people, be it can't communicate their like wants and needs, or be it just they have to, as you say, sometimes fit in with our schedule, then they're then having to tolerate some of those sensory challenges that they have throughout the day. And obviously that's where we come in with some strategies later on in this PowerPoint to try and support those times. Okay, so when we are talking about sensory processing challenges, we can often see that autistic children and young people can be either under responsive to certain stimuli or over responsive. Now, we can be under and over in the different senses, but we don't really see that a child is both under and over responsive within the same sense. I think the probably the easiest example of this is someone who is over responsive to auditory input, where any unpredictable or noise that isn't theirs, they have a very adverse reaction to and they don't like it, but they seem to make lots of noise themselves and they are constantly seeking out their noise, and they might even be quite loud with this. And that's because that's predictable to them. And the more, sometimes it can be that the louder they are, the more they are controlling the auditory environment, so they can predict what is going to happen rather than having to try and tolerate what isn't going to happen. So although it can look like that person might be both under and over responsive in that sense, it is more likely that they are over responsive, but they are fine with their own noise because that's predictable and they know what's going to happen. So when, as I say, when we can look at this in terms of every different sense, and when someone is under responsive to in different senses, we normally see one of two patterns. We'll either see them quite actively seeking out that stimuli. So that might be if someone is seeking vestibular input, they might explore their environment a lot. They might try and climb, run, lots of running, quite a lot of rocking, all of those sorts of activities. That would be someone actively seeking vestibular input. However, if someone is under responsive to vestibular input and they could seem really those like lazy children and young people, and they're not lazy, they're just feeling maybe like very lethargic, they seem quite slow, and you just think, oh, quick, we need to just pick up our feet, but they seem to just not quite get there. That's someone who's quite passive with their under responsiveness, so they're not seeking out to reach their sensory threshold, as this document shows here. So this shows that someone who is under will need lots and lots of stimuli to get to their threshold, and then they might never really see that they're too much from it. And then someone who is over responsive, then you can see here in this orange section that they need only a little bit to get to their threshold, and then it can be a lot for them to process. And this is when we might see the fight, flight, or freeze response. So this happens when our brain and our sensory processing isn't able to process the stimuli that's coming into it, and therefore an appropriate reaction isn't created by us. Again, going back to that fire alarm, yes, we might see that the fire alarm goes off and then we aren't able to process that stimuli, it's too overwhelming, and we've reached that too much stage of over our threshold. So we might see someone go into their fight response, and this can lead to behaviours such as behaviours that challenge. Someone might be seen to be crying or screaming and having like trying to very avoidance behaviours, so avoiding the task at all costs or whatever it is that is making them overstimulated. They also might be very frustrated and angry. So this is one way that our body might react. Another way is the flight response, so just wanting to leave the environment, absolutely just run and bolt out, try and get away from whatever stimuli it is that is just being too overwhelming. They might try and ignore the overwhelming input, so even though you think, but it's right in front of them, what is happening, but they're just completely, they can't process it. And this might look like they're quite anxious or quite worried, and this can make it really, really hard to process any other stimuli in our environment. So if we're then putting instructions and demands on them, this could be really, really hard to process because right now they're just trying to think in survival mode. And then we might have a freeze, so just a freeze response, so completely shutting down. We might flop to the floor, again, unable to take in any instructions and process them, and then just feeling very numb and helpless. So they might know that they want to get out of this situation and they know they want it to stop, but they just don't know how to respond. I think an example that sort of is something that we can kind of relate to in terms of the fight, flight, or freeze response is when, if you can imagine walking down a very dark alley at night and we are hear a rustle or footsteps behind us, or what we think is footsteps, then we're suddenly not processing anything else in our environment. We are completely in that like very high alert stage where we will be processing any sort of stimuli in our environment. We're really reacting to it all. And then say someone did come out and someone was chasing us, one of these responses may happen. And so I think sometimes that can be a way in just sort of relating to what our children, young people might be going through when they are feeling in that fight, flight, or freeze response of just feeling very, very overwhelmed. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about the statistics and the significant challenges that sensory processing can make in the autistic population. So the percentage of children diagnosed with autism who also have sensory processing issues is around 69 to 95%, depending on the study. So in a particular study, young people aged 11 to 17 took place in a questionnaire, and they gathered information based on their sensory challenges within the classroom. So students reported that 88% of them were affected by challenges with hearing, 75% by touch, 50% by visual, and 38% by smell. And research shows that within the autistic population, students consistently experience physical discomfort and anxiety as a result of sensory issues, which can lead to increasing their stress levels. So as Jess was saying before, the tolerance levels, so like their threshold, may be heightened by more than one sense. So that might impact another sense. And studies have also shown that some students are able to tolerate more sensory input when they're calm and regulated, and this tolerance can decrease if students are already anxious and stressed. So that's something that the strategies later that we'll discuss, some of the strategies we can use preemptively to try and reduce that anxiety level for students. Yeah. And so some more statistics. So sensory processing issues are recognised as part of the autism diagnosis. And the DSM-5 criteria does state that the student must have a sensory, may have a sensory preference or challenge which impacts, as Jess was saying before, impacts on their function in their everyday life. And this is, again, something to think about with our students and young people, and just to have in mind that, like, from any age they may have this challenges with sensory processing. So not all students have the ability to communicate how they are feeling, especially regarding their sensory challenges. And so we might have to look at their behaviour and try and find a way to understand what it is that is bothering them or that is challenging for them. So, for example, their behaviour might be that they cover their ears or they're avoiding activities with noise. And as Jess was saying, they would have an aversion to the auditory input. And so that's what we'd be looking to see. And we as therapists, teachers, family and friends need to work as detectives to unpick these sensory challenges within the context of the different environments, and try and work together to find strategies that support students to manage their activities in their everyday lives. And it's important to just consider the student or young person that we're working with or that we know, and to understand that some sensory inputs that might seem very low to us may be experienced in a bigger way than what we can understand. And it doesn't mean that they're not impacted by the sensory input to that level. It's quite important that we work as a multidisciplinary team just to work out if certain behaviours might have a sensory element or a behavioural element or a mix of both, that we can work together to find strategies that support that individual to overcome the barriers that they're experiencing. So Jess has given loads of really nice examples already of sensory challenges. And another one is that in the morning when we get dressed, we might put our socks on, and after a few minutes, we adapt to that sensation, that tactile sensation, and forget about them. For some of our students and young people, tactile sensations like this are felt all day, and they can be intolerable based on fabric and texture. So it's just important to consider that that may be a real feeling for them and a real challenge for them, and to work as a detective to try and empathise and try some strategies to work with them. So some of these quotes are from students and who do have really good verbal communication and were able to explain how they were feeling in specific scenarios. So one of them mentioned that everything smells like poison. His brain feels like his organs turn into jelly, and my chest and spine are in agony always. And so these are things that we might hear, or you might see some behaviour that would lead you to think that this was how they were feeling. And so yeah, I thought this is really a nice way of verbally communicating it, which was great. Okay, so we're going to move on to some strategies, and we're going to start off with some home strategies. So these are some strategies that we can use to try and support students and young people that we know to be able to manage activities at home or in the home environment. So things like using visual timers to manage transitions and changes, or manage time engaging with an activity, can be really useful. Trying to reduce noise and visual clutter to support their visual attention and try and give them a space where their anxiety is reduced. Things like movement breaks and opportunities to access the outdoors is quite researched a lot to show that that does help support our students with their anxiety or their mental health. Watching videos to help parents with a job. So, for example, brushing teeth or your hair, you can find a video that might show the way that you might brush your hair or brush your teeth, and show it to them before doing the activity so that they know what's required of them. And reducing fear around trying new things or new foods by getting involved in the process of making them. So for cooking with food, that can be a really good strategy to support. And you're also incorporating looking at the food, smelling the food, being around it, and just having a positive experience of it in general. And the last one is use of a yellow zone toolbox for calming strategies. And this is linking in with a program that we use at school called Zones of Regulation. And that would mean some strategies to help support students when they have a heightened alertness level. So if they're feeling excited or frustrated, or if they're feeling a bit anxious. So a lot of students will have some known strategies that work, but they may have some strategies that work some of the time. So it may be environmental based on what we've worked out to be supportive for them. And for school and workplace strategies, some other strategies we can use are reducing auditory input. And some of our students, such as the student in the picture above, he uses ear defenders to try and reduce that. And we can use fidget toys to support movement breaks, hand squeezes and counting to manage waiting times, scented items to help with remaining in our own personal space, but having that calming input that we might be seeking from other people, and opportunity to go outdoors again. We have a sensory break, so to allow students to access low stimulus environments, so that if they do have a low threshold for managing visual or auditory environments, then we can kind of leave them in a position at which they're comfortable, just to have a break from all of the noise and the visual around them. And again, we're just talking about the yellow zone toolbox for calming strategies. So there may be more specific ones that are relevant to that environment, that can be used in the workplace environment, that we can try.
Okay, so now for some community strategies. A lot of them do link very closely to the things, and some of them are exactly the same as the ones that Sarah has gone through in the home and the school strategies. And we try and do this to generalize strategies as much as possible, so that our pupils have the most independence with their strategies, as we find the more they do them and the more they practice doing them in different environments, the better they will access them and help with their regulation. So some of these things are repeated, so yes, but that's why, so that we can generalize things. But other things that we can do in the community is making use of quiet time when in supermarkets and shops. As the community is becoming more and more aware of autism, then they are supporting the autistic community with these quiet times in lots of different supermarkets and shops now. Using visual schedules can really, really help, as I mentioned before, particularly with auditory processing. Unpredictable things can be the hardest to process. So having a visual schedule of knowing what to predict in their day and making as much as possible predictable can really help keep that tolerance of the different unpredictable sensory stimuli in their environment. That can really help. Taking resources with you, that Sarah has mentioned before in the home and school strategies. Having communication aids to hand so that we can communicate any feelings of frustration, of upset, of worry, of happiness, of being excited about being in a place. So we can have a schedule to we can schedule our activities in the community to have periods of more challenging things. So if you know that the supermarket is more challenging, but then they really love going to the cafe because they get their favourite drink, then following one up with the other so that they can see in their visual timetable that there's something that they know they can tolerate and really like coming up. And then also participating in calming activities before going out into the community, so getting to baseline and as calm as possible and regulated as possible before that input of more challenging stimuli. And then finally, just to link back to our strategic objectives, as obviously the work that we do is working towards this for the community, as well as as well as our autistic children and young people. So, Sarah, you can start.
Okay, great. I can see we're getting towards the end of the time, and we've got quite a lot of questions that have come in. So this will all be available on the recording. So potentially if we answer one of the questions, and then we'll see if we can get back to the other questions just via email. We'll see if we can do that. So the first question is, so one of the attendees, 3-year-old grandson bites his hand when excited or frustrated, puts a lot of things in his mouth and is constantly moving. Any strategy suggestions would be gratefully received. So lots of the things that we've put on the strategy slides hopefully would have helped. So things like maybe using alternatives to put in his mouth rather than like objects or toys, if that's the kind of thing that he's putting, and use of things like crunchy snacks or chews can be used to kind of support with that, and constantly moving around. If there's activities that he really enjoys, maybe incorporating that into his day, or just making sure he has access to those kind of strategies and just opportunities to move. Yeah. Is there anything else you think, Jess?
Just, I'd say additionally to what Sarah says, they're very, good strategies. Having like a chew, so a chewy that is made, as Sarah says, for chewing, rather, so we can replace that. If he goes to bite himself, then we can give the chewy instead. Also, proprioceptive input is like the magic sense in this, of like being really, really calming. If we think about when we stub our toe or bang something, we rub it with a lot of pressure. We don't lightly rub it. We do as much pressure as possible, and that's really getting that proprioceptive sense to help calm ourselves down. So lots of deep pressure activities like squeezes, tight hugs, and hand squeezes. We can do head pushes and things like that, but deep and slow, I'd say, would be useful as well.
Cool. I think that's all that we've got time for today, but we'll do our best to get back to all the other questions that we've had in. Thank you for everyone very much for coming to our Lunch and Learn, and we hope it's been really useful for everyone.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks.